Before we begin our podcast, please enjoy a reenactment of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address performed at the 2017 Huntington Beach Civil War Days.
Oh my God. Bandmaster, please play Dixie. It's one of my favorite tunes, and it's good that the South to know that they are free to hear it once more. Thank you very much. That tune would always bring a tear to my eye. That was written by a Northerner, and it was actually a very popular song, North and South. Many times in the battlefield, when the troops were adjusting themselves on both sides, trying to get the high ground, trying to figure things out, in the evening, the cool evening, one side, maybe the Southerners would start up that with their band, and the Northerners would take it up, and together they would be playing Dixieland out on the battlefield. And then the next morning they would take up arms and shoot each other. I don't know. Okay, let's see. It is November 18th, about 10:15 at night. Earlier, around sundown, upon entering Gettysburg, I was escorted to the Wills house, where later on I will retire for the evening. But for now, I am restless. My mind is not at peace. This Civil War has gone on much longer than imagined. Can there be hope for a speedy resolve? Can there be hope for an end to aggression? Can there be hope for a lasting peace? Can this be explained to one nation, North and South, that has felt the pain and the suffering? Can I find the right words? I'm sorry. It is late and I must bid you a good evening. And for now, here we are the next day. On this ground, in early July of this year, 1863, history was made. Men gave their lives for what they believed. With raised arms, cheers were lifted up, along with prayers. You see, both sides read the same Bible, pray to the same God, but the prayers of both could not be answered. And for now, the cannons are silent, the muskets have all been stacked aside. There's a solemn presence blanketing these few acres here like an early morning fog. The earth beneath our feet is quietly shouting. Here lies a soldier, a comrade, a hero. Here lies a father, a brother, a son. We are assembled here today to honor those who fought and died on these surrounding battlefields. I have been asked as chief executive of the nation to formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. Can this be accomplished? Standing here before you, many thoughts travel through my mind. And gazing out over the rolling hills, the gentle valleys, the grasses blowing in the breeze, I can see the markers, the mounds of earth, the wooden boxes. Can there be an explanation for such a scene? Can there be comfort for all the sorrow? Can there be an answer to the many questions? What do you tell a mother to ease the pain of her son not coming home? What words do you use for a wife whose husband won't be returning to her? How do you explain to a young child that her father won't be there to see her grow? How do you relate that it was for the right reason? It was for freedom. It was to preserve the Union. What words do you utter? What letters do you write? What address do you speak? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We're met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who fought here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Welcome back. You are now listening to part 2 of our interview with Professor Christopher Stowe, Professor of Military History and War Studies Department Head of Command and Staff College, Marine Corps University.
I have one other question related back to the Civil War.
Sure.
I was surprised as I was researching a little bit before our talk. There were a lot of generals in other important positions in the Confederate Army that also came from the Army Corps and West Point. And I think the surprise was my own, I guess, naive expectation that since the Army Corps was formed and operated in the North, that there'd be more of a maybe an obligation to or that it would attract people that would be sympathetic to more of the Union. And so I was curious, what would have been the sentiment at the time, more from a personal experience, where people are leaving to go to the South? And
well, I mean, it depends on a multitude of factors. Obviously, Southern birth and affinity for Southern society as a result of being a Southerner oneself is probably the largest factor, indeed the largest factor in indicating one's preference to stay in the Union or not. But I mean, it's not watertight. There were Southerners who fought for the Union, and there were Northerners who ended up joining the Confederacy. But the top graduates in antebellum West Point, the top 2 or 3 graduates from every class would be selected to become part of the Corps of Engineers, because of the importance that was placed upon its mission within the larger military scheme. And that, again, there were systems of fortifications building along the coasts, the sea coasts, the first, the second, the third system, as they were called, from the 1780s all the way up into the 1840s, 1850s. And the United States needed those individuals to do that, to lead those public works projects and military projects. But when the Civil War came, many of those officers were of Southern birth. Robert E. Lee is probably the biggest example. And talk about an individual ripped from the headlines right now.
Right,
The
exactly.
public memory of R.E. Lee. But there were others, certainly as well, not nearly as well known as R.E. Lee, who had engineering backgrounds. But Lee was perhaps the most notable engineer, certainly one of the favorites of the commanding general of the United States forces at the beginning of the war, Winfield Scott. He was one of his favorite staff officers, Robert E. Lee was. And he moves obviously towards the Confederacy because of his birth, his family, his ancestral connections to not only Virginia, but to Southern society writ large. And of course, his experience early in the war is that of a classic military engineer. He's building defenses in Georgia and in and around Savannah, and he is somewhat overshadowed in the early months of the war by other commanders such as Pierre Beauregard, who was also an engineer, and others who have more success in the early months. Indeed, when Lee takes command, actual field command in the late spring of 1862 in and around Richmond, many of the soldiers and subordinates within the Confederate forces deride him. They insult him by calling him the King of Spades because of his propensity to dig, which of course is
interesting.
They call him the King of Spades, and others will correct those pejorative comments, and they'll say, listen, Lee will take more chances than anybody if he needs to do so. Audacity might be his middle name, if you don't know the man. And of course, Lee did take those chances during the American Civil War and became one of the more successful tactical and operational soldiers. Though ultimately, strategically, he is defeated. But his principles, his understanding of the principles of engineering are as good as anybody's. But whether or not that could be translated all the way down the force is another question entirely. So your point about the Union engineers versus the Confederate engineers is actually an accurate one. And it's the thesis of the book that I mentioned earlier, is that the Confederacy, though it had engineers of talent, it did not have as robust an establishment as the Federals did. Largely because of again, it's not necessarily it's the military establishment, but it's dearth of civilian expertise in a relative sense to that of the Union.
And I've been learning a lot about the Civil War in the past couple months here.
Gotcha.
And
I continue to learn about the Civil War. There's so much new stuff coming out all the time; it's hard to keep up.
That does seem to be a big theme, though, is the chance taking that General Lee took. What brought the war a lot closer because of General McClellan being a lot more methodical. And, that's a subject that's actually kind of near and dear to my heart. I just received an issue of a prominent academic journal which discusses McClellan as a commander. He's one of the whipping boys of American Civil War history. You'll see editorialists in newspapers today whenever there's a civil military conflict between, say, the president and a general, and they will often evoke the story of McClellan versus Lincoln. This individual who was reticent, cautious, who did not take directions well from higher authority, passive aggressive, versus this individual Lee, who is in sync with his commander-in-chief, that would be Jefferson Davis at the time, of course, and is able to translate, military strategy into success on the battlefield. And the point I'm making here is that McClellan's undergoing a little bit of a reassessment. That there are certain aspects of his character that are true about his perhaps his ego and his prudence, but Lee has to take chances against the institutional strengths of the Union force that McClellan recognizes. McClellan recognizes that the strengths of Union forces are its logistics, its engineering, its artillery, and its ability to support via the sea, naval support. Right.
And what Lee has to do is he has to again develop a countermeasure that basically mitigates those Yankee advantages. So he can't fight the same kind of fight that McClellan fights. McClellan wants to fight a methodical, engineering-based campaign that will be short on catastrophic casualties, while at the same time achieving Yankee ends. Mm-hmm. And that end is the suppression of the Confederate rebellion through the defeat of its field armies. And McClellan and his generals have no problem resorting to Yankee institutional strengths. And those strengths, again, are engineering, artillery, logistics, and naval support. And so Lee has to figure out a way to defeat that. And he's not going to defeat it by fighting the same way the Yankees fight. So what he essentially decides to do, and other Confederate generals, this is not just Lee alone, is they rely largely on much more of a maneuverist mentality, using space as a means to gain the flanks of these slower moving methodical Union forces to achieve local successes that can then be translated into larger success. So you see Lee and Jackson and Forrest and other, even Bragg, who is not necessarily as successful as the others, they attempt broad turning movements and flanking maneuvers in order to mitigate those Yankee strengths in firepower, logistics, and engineering. Does it work? Locally it works. In the end it doesn't, because those Yankee strengths are dare I say, strengthened during the course of the war. Even Grant, who is much more maneuver-oriented than perhaps McClellan, even Grant recognizes the strength of engineering as being decisive in his campaigns. If you look at his decisive wins, Grant's decisive wins in 64, 65, they're largely sieges.
Okay.
Vicksburg, Petersburg. So again, engineering has played such a role in all of this. But yeah, the risk-taking that Lee does, his risk-taking is largely informed by a great understanding of what his society can do and what his military force can do against such a modern behemoth that is the growing Yankee force.
Okay. Oh, that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And I guess great work on McClellan out there that overturns the hackneyed cliches of him. He's almost reviled in a dismissive sort of way, and I'm one of the few, I guess we could call ourselves the happy few, who try to recognize his strengths while certainly understanding his weaknesses.
Right, and I think he was painted poorly in maybe after the Civil War by the historians of the time. Is that?
Oh my gosh! Yeah.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. No, without question, he became the Civil War, perhaps certainly more even than the Revolution, has its mythical figures, and it has its the narrative arc of the Civil War is filled with heroes and villains rather than people, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Right.
And we have, as a society, even among military historians, have our biases and our cherished views and our cherished opinions, and probably more so than any other war in the American experience, there are these larger than life folks, and there's this veneration for certain figures, and there's this revulsion for others. And McClellan, absolutely, along perhaps with Braxton Bragg for the Confederacy, are probably the two who are most hated. I mean, I go to conferences, and if I try to revive McClellan or to understand McClellan, I'm often met with raised eyebrows from individuals, because he's so disliked. I mean, I'll give you a contemporary anecdote about a different officer who was also an engineer, George Meade. After the Battle of Gettysburg, when he's pursuing Lee's army towards the Potomac River from Pennsylvania, Lincoln's his military secretary, a fellow by the name of John Hay. John Hay is writing in his diary after the campaign. Meade is pursuing, but he's pursuing methodically, and not fast enough for many of those individuals in Washington who would like to see a decisive defeat of the Confederate forces resulting in their destruction. And Hay writes, "I doubt him," meaning Meade. "I doubt him, period." And his next sentence is, "He is an engineer."
Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Oh no. There is this disconnect and this desire for decisive battle and decisive campaigning, and unfortunately for the American military art in the Civil War, because of those institutional strengths, engineering, logistics, artillery, the organizations of armies, which are large organizations with subdivided components such as corps and divisions and brigades, it's very difficult to destroy another enemy field army in a single battle. Mm-hmm. And much of the American public doesn't understand this. So when they look at the methodical pursuit of victory, they look at it as somehow being a weakness rather than a strength. And what's interesting to me is it's that methodical understanding of warfare in all of its contexts that ultimately, in my opinion, leads to victory rather than this simple, daring, hell for leather fighting approach.
Okay.
That's my opinion, but again, there are others who would disagree, and I've met many of them.
Well, I have just one more question on this. We were joking a little bit that, or on the phone earlier, was kind of what got me into reaching out to you was in Huntington Beach. We have a Civil War reenactment. And that's where I kind of got the fever to reach out and find out more about the Army Corps because of a few of the booths that they had. And I was joking that, in California, really not major component of the Civil War, but then you had corrected me that actually that was a major.
I wouldn't call it major, but it is certainly an objective of the Confederacy, the warm water ports of Southern California. There were forays undertaken from Texas, from West Texas, in late 1861, and into 1862, to secure what was then known as New Mexico Territory, which encompasses the states of New Mexico, modern states of New Mexico and Arizona. And the desire was, one, to reach the Colorado gold fields, the territory of Colorado, and then to move into the state, the state of California. It is not a territory in 1861. It is a bona fide United State, to possibly seize those areas as well. Now, that never comes close to fruition because the campaign stops cold in modern-day New Mexico, the battles of Glorieta Pass and Val Verde, probably most notably mischaracterized in the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It actually has a Civil War backdrop, that spaghetti western starring Clint Eastwood back in the 60s.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. I mean, it has that with the single worst Civil War battle scene ever put to film, as a matter of fact. That movie. It's very entertaining and very inaccurate. But there was an effort to gain the Colorado goldfields and possibly move into Southern California. And the sentiment among Southern California citizens was not necessarily entirely pro-Union. So it's interesting because Jefferson Davis writes and he speaks before the Provisional Confederate Congress in 1861. He says, "All we want to be is left alone." And that's his war aim, is to secede from the Union and to be left alone. But it's clear in the military conduct of the war, there were aspirations, territorial aspirations for the Confederacy, not only to move into places like Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, which were slave states that remained loyal to the Union, but also to move into the Great West, because warm water ports on the Pacific are really the future of America. I mean, the transcontinental railroad business is proof of that, in order to link markets. And the Confederacy is no less understanding of that than the Union. It's just they don't have the ability to do that. So if there were no, Civil War battles in the West plays an important part in the American Civil War. in fact, a new subfield of American Civil War history. I wouldn't necessarily call it too new, but a subfield of American Civil War history is looking at the West and the United States Army in the West during those years as an integral part of the war itself, even if they're not necessarily fighting Confederates, but it is still part of that mosaic that is the American Civil War. The Union general who was in command in the Pacific was a fellow by the name of Carleton, and he's very, very little known in American military history, but he's very, very important in the sense is that he's fulfilling national objectives in the West, while back in the Mississippi River Valley and east towards the Appalachians, of course, the United States Army is fighting a death struggle against a rebellious faction. But it's a really interesting and emerging field, looking at the West and integrating how really the future, and that the future is not only Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Washington, but especially California, in realizing the dreams of what some would call American empire.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, or maybe the one of the most fascinating things about history is trying to get the context of the time. Like you were saying, that the Californians generally wanted to be left alone or not be a part of it. That's interesting.
Yeah,
I've never heard that before. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and yet there were some who certainly wanted to be part of the Confederate movement. It's I mean, there were military stations out in California throughout the years before the American Civil War. In the Presidio in Los Angeles, one of the great mythical stories. I wouldn't say it's mythical, but it's taken on mythic status. Is at Los Angeles in 1861. There's a party being thrown between officers who were remaining loyal to the Union and those who had tendered their resignation to join the Confederacy. And at the party were two officers who were tremendous friends, one from Pennsylvania, and fellow by the name of Winfield Hancock, and another from Virginia by the name of Lewis Armistead, or Umstead, as some members in the family refer to the family name. And these two individuals were great friends, and they met, 3 years later, if not physically met, their commands met at Gettysburg at Pickett's Charge. Armistead's brigade led, some would say, led the spearhead. They were part of the spearhead. They were actually in the second brigade line of Pickett's division, but they got to the stone wall, and the commander of the Union force at that stone wall was Winfield Hancock. So they meet, and in a figurative sense, they're both wounded, and Armistead, of course, is mortally wounded at Gettysburg, dies, and Hancock is wounded quite severely, and so you have this heartbreaking meeting in Los Angeles in 1861. This party that is thrown, a solemn party where songs are sung and individuals clasp hands and tears are shed, and then 2 years later they meet in the fields of Pennsylvania in a different environment that probably neither of them had fully grasped as early as 1861. So
wow.
The brotherhood is interesting. I mean, it's hard for me as a person who works for the military to understand a party being thrown for individuals who are resigning from your force in order to fight you. But
right.
It's a different time. The past is a foreign country, to be sure.
What would have been the motivation for those so far removed, say on the West Coast, to support, the Confederacy?
Family ties,
Family
commercial ties.
Okay.
I mean, politics is certainly local, but again, I mean, there are different perceptions of federal power. Small government, activist government.
Okay.
We have these are the questions that certainly are resonant throughout all eras of American history, and they were no less relevant back then. And so, whether you're an engineer or an infantryman or an artilleryman, you have those family ties and those political perspectives that may do that, and that's true of the citizenry as well.
Okay. So, what was your first hook into history?
Oh, Dad taking me to Gettysburg in 1975. It's
Okay.
real simple. Oh yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm from the Great Lakes area of Pennsylvania, and Gettysburg is about a 5-hour trip back in the maybe a 6-hour trip back in the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit era of 1975. And my
Okay.
father, who caught the bug in the Centennial era in the 60s, in the 1961 to 65, which was the Civil War centennial. My father caught the bug, started reading the most popular Civil War historian of that era, a guy named Bruce Catton, who remains just an evocative writer, wonderful, evocative prose. His works in the Civil War, which were popular in the 50s and 60s, he gave his 8-year-old son, his youngest son, one of those books about the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, and said, "Read it. We're going to Gettysburg." And I'm an 8-year-old kid. I didn't understand exactly what I was reading in places, being 8, but I read it, and I went with him, and that was it. After when you're a teenager, you get into other things. I was, more impressed with hair bands in the 80s than I was with history and all that kind of stuff. And but then in college, I started getting back into it. I was a communications major, but I minored in history, and soon realized that I was more interested in looking at history from an academic perspective than I had been before. But I was always a young Civil War buff, not a reenactor or anything like that. But I always was interested in it and would go to battlefields with my father and my brothers throughout the late 70s and early 80s before actually taking the jump into graduate school in the early 90s. So it was that. And then I looked at George Meade as an individual. He was the victor at Gettysburg and somewhat underemphasized as the victor. That occurred to me, and it occurs to a lot of people, not just me. Early on, as a late teenager, here's the guy who won the what is considered by many to be the great battle of the war, and yet he's a footnote in American history. There have been books written about just that very thesis, and so I decided I'm interested in this guy. And when you become interested in Meade, you become interested in engineering because that's what he does. And so the Topogs and the Corps of Engineers, Joseph Totten's Corps of Engineer and John Abbott's topographical engineers became very important to me as I dived through the archives. Looking at the archives in Washington of the engineers is a fascinating experience.
Wow.
Not that I necessarily understand all of what they're saying,
right?
But because I'm terrible at math, unfortunately, I wanted to follow my brother's footsteps. My brother's a mechanical engineer, and get into engineering. I wanted to be a civil engineer when I was a teenager, and then I realized that mathematics wasn't my strong suit.
Okay.
And so I had to look at it from another perspective,
a
historical perspective. Yeah, no, indeed.
So it's interesting that you chose a field that has both, some of the engineering side and then the historian side as well.
The humanities side is really my comfort zone. But pouring through George Meade's soundings in the Florida Keys when he's looking at the soundings of the coral reefs in order to erect these lighthouses, many of which still stand today when you're driving down Route 1 towards Key West. If you look off in the distance, you can see Sombrero Key and the lighthouse that he built, that he designed and built in the 1850s. And looking at the soundings and the amazing ability to do all of this in one's head without any kind of digital assistance is just astounding to a humanities nerd like myself.
Yeah,
pouring through it.
It's funny actually today, even for when we do bridge inspections, we still sometimes use chains to sound the deck and see.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, to see if the concrete is poor quality in one area or another.
You're right.
So,
really? Okay.
Off. Yeah.
No, it really is interesting. You look at even in my research and research methods that we do now, the reliance upon digital platforms is so great that in many ways those skills, those research skills that we learned in graduate school in the 90s are lost. But it's heartening to see actually in hard science that it's not entirely lost.
Right.
It's
Right.
it's still there. Those skills, I guess, can become perishable if they are allowed to perish.
Right.
Yeah, right.
We were talking about a little bit earlier about cartography, and
Sure.
one thing I really enjoy are illustrative tools in engineering. Graphs and things that
Sure.
really help to get is to get a read on results. Are they accurate or not? And if you can interpret the data in different ways, it's helpful. And I know you're familiar with the famous statistical graphic by Charles Joseph Menard on Napoleon's Russian campaign of 1812.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's behind my chair in my office. So I'm going to stare at it wistfully while I speak with you right now.
Okay.
I have it framed. I could take a picture and send it to you on my phone after we're done here. Yeah, isn't it awesome?
It's one of my favorite. Yeah, it's one of my favorite graphs. It's so intuitive, and he was the first one, I think, really to lead that kind of intuitive graphing. And I was wondering two questions, I guess. One, is there an analog for the Civil War of a similar type?
I have not seen anything quite like it.
I don't think so either. Yeah, because I was researching it. I thought there must
I really
be,
haven't.
Okay.
If there was, I would have it. I mean, I would have a copy of it, obviously not the original, but I would have a copy of it here. But the carte figurative, as I look at it, I will not continue to read en français here as I stare at it. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing quite like it before or since Napoleon's march to Moscow. Showing the diminution of the force, along with the time and space considerations that were represented, as well as temperature.
Right. Right.
And the temperature is the march back. So you're doing it in, I think there's four measures of analysis of the campaign that are represented in one dimension.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's
it's
amazing.
So beautifully done. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at it right now. I'm standing right now because I'm getting old and I can't read. 422,000 cross the Niemen River, and then 10,000 return.
Right.
Later in the year. Yeah, it's astounding, but I think it speaks to the value of these representations in understanding the scope of campaigns.
Right.
And though the Civil War doesn't have an analog to that, I mean, one could look at the official atlas of the Union and Confederate armies, and it's available on Amazon or half.com.
Sure.
It's a big book, but one can look at that, and if you can't find an analog, you can certainly see the importance that is placed on these individuals getting it right from a map making perspective, because there are no commercial maps that you can buy in a in a gas station or at a bookstore in this time period. These maps are notoriously poor during this time. So the ability of the topographical engineers and the civilian map makers who are often employed by them to do this work is of utmost importance, because it provides the intelligence preparation of the battlefield is what we call it, IPB in acronym land. It provides a portion of the intelligence preparation of the battlefield that is essential to any commander achieving any kind of success.
So is there graphical representations? Is that still a tool that's useful today?
Oh my gosh, yes. Without question. I mean, we do exercises, military exercises, staff exercises here at the Command and Staff College, and it's a department that is not associated necessarily with me, where the War Studies is essentially the history department. But we have other departments at our staff college and the other branches, other services of the United States military have their equivalents. The Army Command and General Staff College, the Air Force Staff College, etc. We have our exercises, military exercises, which are planning exercises, and they're fictional. They don't necessarily deal with what staffs are doing in the operational field. But what they do, their purpose is to train individuals on the proper, procedures of staff work, and graphical depictions, whether using Google Earth or other mediums, other platforms, is absolutely part and parcel to
Okay.
what we're trying to accomplish. So there's no question. It's just a different technological platforms. But even using two-dimensional maps is still, there's utility for that. Even in the digital world, we don't use the grease pens and the overlays as much as was used in previous generations. But
Right.
still, that's absolutely vitally important graphical depictions of what we would today call the battle space or the area of operations or whatnot. Yeah. Sure.
So just a few more questions for you. What aspects of your work require the most creativity and also the least creativity?
Writing is writing is a slog. Writing is a state of mind. There's so many distractions in this world.
Right.
I mean, I don't do social media for the very simple reason is that I would never get anything done. I decided to bow out from it about a year after I got into it. So the creativity of it all is writing, but there's other aspects of it too. It's formulating a thesis, and the thesis is driven by evidence, obviously. So it's not necessarily a deductive process as much as it is an inductive process. So if the evidence is taking you towards a thesis, one has to navigate those waters rather carefully because you don't want to be too broad. You don't want to be telling too many stories in support of your main idea because you could get lost in the solution, so to speak. You can't necessarily recognize the tree within the forest, and then there's the vice versa. If you specialize too much, you might not get the context might not be there. So it is somewhat chaotic. It's funny. It's interesting. Chaos theory is enjoying a bit of in the past 15 years or so is enjoying a bit of popularity within the historical field because of the waywardness of it all. The fact that if you're telling your story can change as a result of just the simplest question that one is asking. For example, if one asks a question with a different tone, your narrative can be completely different. It can come up with an absolutely different conclusion, and that's something that's hard for some individuals to understand because they think history is just the facts.
Right.
It's just a narrative of events, and history really isn't. It's an argument, and an argument has to be informed by not only evidence but also it has to be formulated as a result of a specific set of questions that one is asking, and that's really the creative part of it. Non-creative part is adhering to particular style manuals in order to get your citations right. For example,
right? Okay.
Chicago, MLA, APA. Well, we use the Chicago style. Footnotes, endnotes, all that. That's placing your comma in the right place and your semicolon in the right place. That's kind of the nug work that. I actually list one of my hobbies as the Chicago Manual of Style because.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a funny story related to that. We have a great engineer working with us, and he actually has an undergrad in history, and then he got his graduate degree in structural engineering.
Gotcha.
And I thought I was a pretty good writer here in our group, but actually I had him QC one of the things I was writing, and he was definitely busting my chops about specifically about those rules. I didn't use commas or certain articles, and it was pretty funny.
Yeah, I mean we're famous in our little corner of the world here for saying "thou shalt not use passive voice," for example. It's
right.
When we're doing track comments on our students' work, we'll write PV everywhere, passive.
Okay.
Passive. That's I don't know if that's our every profession, every I guess field vocation has its rules, right?
Yeah.
And we have ours, and they're no less bewildering than others. But the real joy in it, the real challenge, the creativity comes in the writing and the conceptualizing a work from start to finish. And the reality is that if you start a work, oftentimes the work that you've produced doesn't necessarily resemble that which you envisioned when you began. You know, you shouldn't start with your thesis made up and your mind made up on your thesis, and then gather all the evidence that supports your thesis without recognizing that they're differing viewpoints. I mean, that's not history. That's a polemic argument. You shouldn't argue from your conclusion. You should let the information inform your conclusion.
So back to the chaos theory, because that sounds really interesting. If I can ask a question on this, is the idea that as you document an idea about history, if you were to pose one question versus another, or like you said, a certain tone, maybe by accident, that then you're influencing history? Is that the idea?
Oh, without question. You nailed it. History is, I think it was Ambrose Bierce, I could be wrong on this, characterized history as lies agreed upon. And and he was a soldier in the American Civil War. He fought in the I believe the Army of the Cumberland, Union Army of the Cumberland. And it's fascinating because many in outside the historical field will again believe history is just the facts, and then you'll get the term, a derisive term that is labeled towards historians. They'll say, well, that's just mere revisionist history. And you'll hear that in the political arena, in the pundit arena, elsewhere. Well, that's just revisionist history. And my answer to that is, well, all history is informed by the era in which the individual, she or he, is asking what particular questions. Let's be perfectly clear. Understandings of the American Civil War in the 1920s are way different than they are now. Because in the 19 teens and the 1920s, the Lost Cause, which was the large meta narrative, the controlling narrative of the war that the White South embraced, that the Lost Cause had become basically, if not entirely, the accepted narrative of the American Civil War. These very valiant white Southern individuals who fought against the double-headed hydra of Yankeedom and abolition, and that became a big deal, and that became accepted. But by the 1950s and 1960s, that narrative had started to crumble under the weight of, you guessed it, the civil rights movement, and so that's going to change the approach and the questions individuals ask. And now here we are in the post. Some people would call it the postmodern or the postmodern era, and there are many different questions that are being asked with regards to race, gender, ethnicity, and looking at it through the lens of science and environmentalism. Big field right now in the American Civil War is the effects of the Civil War on the environment, as well as how the environment affected the conduct of the war itself. And that's a burgeoning field with tremendous work is being done. I'm not at the vanguard or even close to the vanguard of the environmental history of the war, and that's those questions are largely informed by what matters to us today, right? Okay. And so, so if anybody says, well, that's merely revisionist history, my answer would be, well, yeah. It all is. We all ask questions based on our own particular experiences, and biases cannot necessarily be ruled out. What's important to one generation might not be important to another generation.
Oh, that is fascinating. Well, I have one last question for you. I always like to ask, what form of art do you enjoy in your own life for relaxation?
Oh, gee. Okay. Well, I'm obviously like music. It's funny. I'm nostalgic for like '80s British synth pop more than anything else nowadays.
Oh, okay.
Stuff I
Nice.
didn't listen to when I was in the '80s. When I was a young kid, I listened to hair metal, and
Okay.
I can't even listen to that now without a shudder. As far as art goes, as a young, canvas art, as a young adult, I liked Baroque and more traditional art, and now with my wife and I, we're really into modern art now. I still have a soft spot for some of the early impressionists, but really like modern art. Music, again, I'm 50 years old, but I still listen to a lot of modern alternative rock and jazz and all that kind of stuff. I try to stay as young as possible with that.
Oh, cool.
Again, 80s synth pop as a means of nostalgia. I'm mourning the elimination of the Cleveland Indians from the American League playoffs right now.
Okay.
They were eliminated. That's not art. That's something quite different. But
Right.
but I guess the Yankees took them while I was in Hawaii on vacation. So the games ended early, so it enabled me to drown my sorrows on the beach.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's good at least.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, music, art, and that I'm warming up in my older age to some of the more modern conceptions of art in all of its dimensions, 3D, etc. So
Right. Speaking of art, or modern art, I guess, I don't know if this is modern art or not, but it was fun. Maybe a year ago, we have this hanging on our wall now, but I had the idea. We took a canvas just took it off the frame, and we loosely pinned it around our little dog Betty, and then we painted her while she ran around in the backyard.
Oh no!
And so then she loved it.
Okay.
Now we have that hanging up, and it's actually quite a dynamic painting. I think it's got a lot of, it's not very static. I mean, it looks like there's movement in the painting because
it's like motion.
So squiggly,
So you took a frame off and you let me get this straight. You put it on the pup.
Well, I cut the canvas off of the frame, so it was definitely really loose, and then just put it around her like a towel or a blanket.
Oh,
and,
okay.
And,
This is
and loosely like just
okay, good. And running around the
and then she's running around and having fun while we're painting her.
That's like a Halloween costume on dogs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that was a lot of fun.
That's good. That's good. And so you painted it.
Yeah, we painted it now, and then I put it back on the frame, and now that's hanging in our in one of our rooms.
That's fantastic. That is actually life meeting art.
There you go.
I know. No, that's fantastic. No, I don't think my Jack Russell Terrier would not abide by that. I just want to let you know. No, that would be the end of our relationship. She would. There would be litigation involved.
Right.
By our feisty Jack Russell.
Wow.
So, yeah. No, this is good.
Well, thank you, Professor Stowe. I think I've taken up more than enough of your time. It's really been a lot of fun talking with you. And
this is great. No,
I've learned so much.
It's funny. It's funny. Yesterday, I'm after getting off the plane at 5:30 in the morning, I'm doing a little bit of prepping here, and I didn't want to be too deep. I do have a couple books though. I wanted to
absolutely, please
suggest to folks. In addition to the Thomas Army book called Engineering Victory.
Okay.
Another book by a Canadian officer, actually. A fellow by the name of Ian Hope. Easy, like Bob Hope, but first name Ian. And it's just simply called A Scientific Way of War.
Okay.
That looks at the pre-Civil War years, the period between the Revolution and the Civil War, and how the ascendancy of military science occurred through the contextual factors that I mentioned, but in much more detail and much more eloquently than I had discussed is another really good one. A book on West Point, probably out of print, is called The Best School in the World. That's the name of it. It's by a fellow by the name of James Morrison, not the former leader of the Doors. James, I think, M. Morrison. And that's a book that discusses West Point. A book called An American Profession of Arms by a fellow by the name of William Skelton. is a broad survey of the institutional military from its beginnings through to the American Civil War, discussing this period that we talked about. It's a much broader look, not just at the engineers, but at the whole work. And then finally, a work that discussed some of the things that we just finished with about chaos theory and how history is informed by the natural sciences, is a wonderful book that it's a great Kindle read. You know, one of those things, if you're sitting in an airport, you can just knock it off in a couple of days. It's called Landscapes of History. Landscapes or Landscape. It's either plural or singular. But it's by a fellow by the name of John Lewis, Lewis, Gaddis, Gaddis. He's a giant in the American historical field, and it's a chatty book. It's not a history book as much as it is a series of essays talking about the craft of history and how to do it. And he relates it more to the natural sciences and to chaos theory than he does to the social sciences.
Okay.
You know, like poli-sci and others.
Right.
And it's a really evocative. It's intellectual, but it's not, it's not existential or deeply philosophical. It's easy to read and it's entertaining. And so if your listeners want to take a look at history as a craft, how we do history, I think there's no better start than that what I call a nice Kindle book, a really enjoyable read that you can do without looking at the footnotes and all that kind of stuff. So that's
cool.
Landscapes of History.
Well, I definitely have a lot of reading material ahead of me, and I'll post those links also for our listeners.
Please
but
do.
Those sound really fascinating.
No,
So.
my endorsement is. I don't know any of these individuals particularly well personally, so I'm not necessarily looking to enrich them. I think that, but to enrich your listeners. These are some books that are a real great start.
Well, thank you again so much. It's really been a lot of fun, and
thank you.
I'd like to interview you again sometime if you don't mind. It's really fun.
Absolutely. And if I'm out in Southern California, Huntington Library is one of the best Civil War archives in America. I've done some research there once out in San Marino.
Oh, that'd be fun.
And I'd love to come out. Maybe
that'd be great.
Have a chat sometime. Sure.
Okay. Well, thanks again. All right.
Indeed. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You have been enjoying sounds and music from the Civil War reenactment at the 2017 Huntington Beach Civil War Days. Do I have to say all the other ones?
Yeah, it's almost over.
Aww.
Okay, ready?
You have been enjoying the art of engineering, exploring the overlap in engineering and art. Seems a bit hard on this part, doesn't it?
It is a little bit hard.
You can find us online at iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and at www.taepodcast.com.
Really good.